What we are going forward with is Alistair, Gilbert from Basware. And as we were bouncing back some ideas for the speech, we came across Conway's law, and there's this old expression that if you give a task to 4 teams to build a compiler, what you will get is a 4-way compiler. And that brought us into Conway's law in Overdrive, meaning how to apply that in the whole organizations. So without further ado, let me introduce Alistair.
So, my name's Alistair Gilbert. I'm VP for Product Development at Basware, and as Larry said, today I'm here to talk to you about how the effects of Conway's law goes into Overdrive when operating as a true cloud company. Conway's law is probably quite familiar to a lot of people in this audience, but hopefully this is a slight variation or slight twist to the whole conversation. So, just to kind of reiterate for those that are not familiar, so any organization that designs a system will produce a design whose structure is a copy of the organization's communication structures. Don't worry if that doesn't make too much sense. We're going to go through that slide by slide. So, a company is presented with a problem. And what do you do as a company? Well, you form a team around that problem. And of course, that team looks to solve that problem. And this is a product development conference, right? So they solve that problem with software. And at that point, the team becomes inextricably tied to the software it produces. Of course, the people within the team, they can come and go, but the actual team itself, or the software, it can't evolve, it can't be maintained, it can't continue to function without the team surrounding it. And of course, the software grows, and as it grows, it becomes more complex, and you try to address that complexity through modularization, through the component, breaking things down into context-bounded components, and so on and so forth, in order to address the complexity and the size. And as the size grows and the complexity grows, naturally, what happens is the teams grow. There's more people required to maintain it, to keep it running. And we're all familiar with Bezos's 2-pizza rule by now, that at a certain point, the team gets to such a size that the team can no longer remain as efficient as it can be, and you have to start to break the team down into sub-teams, if you like. So maybe you take a context-bound proportion of, the components, and you hand it over to one team, and you leave another team behind with the remaining components. But those teams, they need to be able to collaborate, they need to be able to work together. These components are still part of an underlying singular system, right? And if you split those teams, how are they going to manage dependencies? How are they going to manage cross-prioritization, releasing, things like this? Well, you need to form some form of structure around those teams. That might be, in this simple example, it's probably about just making sure they're sat next to each other. But if you blow this out into an extended size, into an enterprise scale, then you need organization structure, you need process, you need governance. You need all those things that are necessary to enable these teams to work together, to collaborate. So in the next section, I'm going to take a slightly larger example. It's still not like a production scale system, but it's large enough to kind of look at some of the effects of Conway's law in a bit more detail. So in this example, we have 6 components represented as the green circles, and they're connected up systematically through the green lines between the circles. And then, obviously, each component has a team, and those teams are inside an organization, a structure made up of subdivisions, divisions, etc. And these surrounding elements, they're not just talking here about the actual organization structure by itself, we're also referring to the process, the governance, and every aspect inside that structure that facilitates communication and collaboration. And within this example, we can draw out patterns of collaboration and communication that exist, that are facilitated through this process, through this governance and structure. And the first of these patterns is the one that enables teams inside subdivisions to communicate and collaborate with teams within inside the division itself. There's two examples of that on screen now. I should probably get out of the way, actually. Now, the second, and this is moved, so I'll go over this side now. The second one of these enables communication and collaboration between teams directly within inside a single subdivision. And then finally, we have the pattern that enables teams directly within inside a division to communicate and collaborate with each other. So, in this example, if we consider the need for data exchange between component A and component B, and therefore team A and team B, there's no actual pattern of communication that exists between the teams in these different subdivisions. Now, of course, it's kind of hard to picture this in such a simple example, right? Because the natural thought is, well, surely these teams know each other, they know about each other, they can just work together. But if you expand this out into more of an enterprise scale with potentially hundreds of teams, hundreds of components that make up the system, it's highly plausible that these teams do not know each other. They may be in different geographies. They're completely unaware of the functionality and the components that these teams deliver. So how is this data going to transfer across the system? Well, one viable option is, of course, naturally over time, this data could just progressively hop between the components to enable it to be exchanged. But more likely what's going to happen is the functionality is simply going to be duplicated across these two components. And if the data gathering part of this data acquisition for component A and component B is duplicated, and that data is coming from a customer, for example, well, that's going to generate a very negative customer experience because the same data is effectively going to be acquired from the customer in two different contexts twice. And this is an example of a kind of architectural growth limitation that gets exhibited through Conway's law. Now, if we take a look at that same kind of limitation, so we're still talking about the lack of a pattern within inside the organization to facilitate communication between teams within inside different subdivisions. Well, in this example, what we're envisaging is moving team A from one subdivision to another. So from the bottom subdivision to the top. Now, there's a pre-existing technical integration between component A and component B. So if you move team A from the bottom subdivision to the top, you effectively limit their ability as a team to collaborate and communicate with the team that's responsible for component B. In other words, what will happen is the technical integration that exists between these components will degrade over time, and the quality of the service as a whole, therefore, will also degrade. So it's really important you understand the impacts of your organization, changes that you might want to make, no matter how small they might be, on the system itself. You need to make sure teams can collaborate and communicate with each other. So I want to return briefly to Conway's law and talk about this concept of a system. So again, any organization that designs a system will produce a design whose structure is a copy of the organization's communication structure. But what is a system? How do we perceive, how do we define the word system, particularly in a true cloud services company context? Well, I'm going to go through a kind of timeline here, if you like. I've just arbitrarily picked a timescale. I've said over a decade ago. Maybe it was 20 years for you. Maybe it was 5. Maybe it was yesterday. Kind of ignore the timescale. But a reasonable time ago, we started to perceive, or we did perceive, this system concept as effectively just the core product, the components that belong to the product code base. And as a result of this, the effects at which Conway's law applied was simply a subset of the product organization. Again, some arbitrary timeline ago, let's say 5 years, the system started to be perceived as more than just the core product, but the platform as well. So the system, the platform, the shared services upon which the product resides, as well as all of the systems that were necessary to facilitate the delivery of that solution, that system, into use. So we're talking about the platform services, the shared services, the infrastructure as code, the test automation, the CI/CD systems, things like that. And as a result of this, the effects of Conway's law started to expand to a larger subset of the product organization. Moving forward then to maybe how organizations are maybe perceiving it now, then it's more than just the core product. It's more than just the platform. It starts to extend into the kind of operational system components as well. So the systems that are required to ensure that the service as a whole remains operational, that it meets service level objectives and things of that nature, that it remains performant and operational. So health and performance monitoring solutions, your operational automation platforms and systems and no-op systems, your security solutions that help with detect, prevent, identify, respond and recover, etc. Effectively everything that's needed to run in production. And as a result of this, the extent to which Conway's law started to apply started to extend beyond just the product organization and into the kind of operations organization, if you like, as well. But how do we need to see it? Well, we need to see it as something significantly larger. So the SaaS business model, it means that we're delivering a complete service. What does that mean? It means it's more than, as Colin was saying, it's more than just the product that we deliver, the functionality we deliver. It's every single end-to-end use case and experience that the customers go through, every single touch point. At this point, and as a result of this, the concept of a system expands significantly. We're now talking about every touch point. So for example, you may need some very heavy integration between your support systems and the core product itself. That might mean, within product support, so chatbots, things like that. It might mean direct communication with your support staff through the application. It could just simply mean integration to your ServiceNow system or whatever to raise incidents and support requests. You need ever more advancing configuration portals that you can provide to your professional services department or your partner network, or even from a self-service perspective to your customers themselves, to facilitate ever-increasing time-to-value capabilities. You need advancing integration between your product and maybe your contract management, your ERP systems, things of that nature, to enable super quick onboarding from the moment that the contract is signed. The customer is able to log in and start using the system. And maybe we're talking about advanced integrations between your product and maybe your service catalog, your billing, and your invoice system to have reliable understanding given to the customer about how much they're using and therefore how much they have to pay. And as a result of this, the effects of Conway's law start to go way, way beyond just the product organization and the operations organization, and they extend into what I've referred to here as the corporate systems. Corporate systems is more of a kind of abstract, generalized term, I would say, that is more representative of any organization within, say, your business that effectively owns components that can be perceived as part of the system. So why is this a problem? Well, if you started your life as a true SaaS company, this isn't particularly a problem at all. You've built your organization and your communication and your collaboration around these concepts. But in a kind of more enterprise-style company that hasn't started life in such a way, you often have organizational boundaries and departments, so there are these very strong, well-established silos. These departments are typically capable of unilateral decision-making, and they typically operate with slow OLA-based interfaces, particularly across departmental boundaries. So there has to be significant change of some form to enable this communication and collaboration between the teams that are responsible for these components that now make up this wider system, so that we can facilitate those end-to-end use cases associated with all these customer touchpoints. And without this, effectively these systems won't be able to be integrated, and you won't be able to deliver a seamless experience for all of these touchpoints. So what's the solution? So in the following slides, I'm going to discuss kind of 3 domains or areas in which focus should be applied. Now, it's important to realize that no one of these domains can progress independently. This is a journey that a company typically has to go on, and the maturity of these domains needs to increase kind of in tandem. Again, just to reiterate a little bit on the objective. So the objective is to make it possible for these components of the wider system, including these outer rim components, if you like, to be able to communicate, to establish integrations on a systematic level. And as said, in order to do so, we need to enable communication and collaboration between the teams responsible for these components. And that comes in the form of the patterns we establish within inside the organization. to facilitate that communication and collaboration. So this first domain focuses on the organization constructs that facilitate that communication and that collaboration. Now, I'm very cautious here not to explicitly say that this demands organization change. While that may be required, it's not the objective here. The objective is to enable communication and collaboration. So, as I said, effectively you need to introduce these patterns of organization, of collaboration within the organization. And this could constitute, simply booking a meeting. In a small-scale level, it may involve process and governance change, and it may also involve organization change. It really all depends on the size and the scale of the pre-existing organization. If you're dealing with a relatively small, already quite lean and agile organization, then the chances are that the volume of change you have to go through in this context is relatively small as well, and maybe there's no kind of structural organization change that's necessary. Excuse me. However, in, let's say, a more well-established enterprise organization, you probably have very strong departmental boundaries, very kind of powerful departments. And as a result of that, the nature and the scale of the change that you have to go through here is going to be much more significant. And you're more likely to have to go through organizational restructuring changes as well. Now, the second domain, this focuses on the teams themselves, and particularly those teams that are kind of part of this outer rim, if you like, so responsible for these components that are kind of new to the system, if you like. These teams, or some of these teams at least, they need to switch from, let's say, more of a service team-based model and into what I refer to as a product team-based model. So what is a service team? So a service team typically sees its component as a relatively static construct. These teams focus much more around keeping the lights on, servicing standard simple change requests. And as a result of this, the competence and the capacity of these teams tends to reflect the kind of repetitive nature of the work that they have to perform. If we take an example, so if we take an identity and access management solution, a service team responsible for one of these are going to be far less concerned with the architecture, the technology of the solution itself. That will be seen as a relatively static thing that they actually try to avoid making changes to. Instead, they're going to focus their attention, their time around provisioning access, changing roles and rights and things of that nature. Now, a product team, on the other hand, puts the design and the capability of the component itself at the center of what they do. They listen to the users and they create a backlog and a roadmap for that component, both from the context of what the users need for that component, as well as taking into account the needs of that component from a wider perspective from the system as a whole. And in order to facilitate that, there's the necessity for that team to collaborate and communicate with the other teams that are responsible for other components that make up the wider system as well. As a result of all of this, the capacity and the competence requirement of a product team tends to be quite significantly higher to enable it to make significant change on a very frequent basis. Now, of course, I'm not suggesting that all teams that own these kind of service components, or all teams that are service teams responsible for components have to transition to product teams. That would be obviously a very expensive exercise to do on an organizational level. But what I am saying is wherever there's a recognized need for a very heavy level of integration between, let's say, the more core product components and these outer rim components, if you like, and you can perceive a high chance of constant change being required with regards to those integrations, then the chances are those teams are going to have to transition into more of a product team model. And now the third domain of change. Now this focuses on the kind of enterprise mindset change that's necessary. And where the second domain, let's say, was more relevant to those teams that are coming into this system concept, I would say this one's particularly relevant to those pre-existing ones, the already existing product teams. So just to reiterate, a true cloud solution, within a true cloud solution, the customer is concerned with the service as a whole. And therefore, we, as the provider of the service, we need to be concerned with all of these customer touch points. And these touch points, they represent effectively a set of end-to-end use cases. They represent a set of new components, and they represent a set of new actors that need to be taken into account when thinking about the system and when thinking about what that system needs to do. Now, all these additional actors, components, and use cases, they need to be factored in when designing, testing, and delivering new capabilities. Product teams as a whole, but especially product management, architects, and testers, need to expand their understanding of this system and take these constructs and these concepts into account. So product management, they need to consider the needs of the wider persona base within these additional use cases. Architects must design solutions to take in as well these new personas and these new components and these wider use cases, as must testers. In other words, everyone really needs to perceive and understand that the system is a far larger concept. So, what will happen as these domains mature? Well, first of all, obviously, what will start to happen is collaboration between teams across the wider RIM component set, if you like, and the inner RIM, the product components. The collaboration will start to take place. And on the back of that collaboration, we'll start to see integrations, technical and architectural connectivity being established between the components. And on the back of these connections, we'll start to see improvements to these customer touch points on an end-to-end basis. And as a result of that, the entire system will start to serve these customer touch points. And in doing so, our customers will start to receive a true cloud SaaS experience. Now, I've realized I've gone through that a little bit faster than maybe I should have done. But that marks the end of my presentation.
At least for me, it was very interesting thing, and I think that kind of sums up what I was also saying in the very beginning about the whole product thinking. I think that's exactly like looking from the different direction, the thing that you need to think about the whole, and I think it ties up very well to Colin's presentation also. But rather than me just talking, maybe are there questions?
You mentioned that the product could be applied at the component level. Is that a cause for a high fragmentation, perhaps? And how does it apply, for an example, if you have a company that has a lot of legacy components and would like to switch to a product mentality, how would you be able to do the transition?
Well, yeah, it's a really good question. I think as a business as a whole, you need to understand what the touch points are and what the use cases that you're trying to facilitate to deliver a good experience from a cloud perspective. And if the components that are needed in order to facilitate those touch points are considered legacy or considered unimportant within your organization, then you've probably got a problem. They shouldn't be. So you need to actually start to emphasize and see those things as critical components of the system and establish a product team mentality around them, I would argue. Does that answer your question?
And kind of interesting, you mentioned that you don't necessarily need to change the organization. And I think that it's like opposite idea what Conway has. So how would you, or do you have some ideas or hints how you actually make sure about the cooperation and communication if you don't change the organization?
Yeah, okay, that's a really good question. So the way I interpret Conway's law, at least, is not really necessarily about the physical organization structure necessarily. It's about all of the concepts and constructs that exist to facilitate communication and collaboration, which can be process. It can be things like physical location and where people are sat. It can also be about the culture that's driven from a top-down perspective that drives a more open atmosphere and collaboration sense. It can be about the kind of formality that you place around portfolio management and product management and how structured that is. So it's a whole wealth of things that I guess you can loosely classify under process governance and ways of working and culture, and that you can then put under a macro concept of the organization. So you asked about tips. Well, I think the key thing is data and measuring. You know, if you've defined your system, first of all, and you truly understand what that system is and the components that make up that system as a whole, Then you understand who needs to be able to collaborate and communicate with each other in order to establish the necessary integration. Then you can start to measure whether that's taking place. And through that, you can start to understand what you need to change. And it could be any number of things, right? And I don't want to kind of suggest, one size fits all for any organization. The key thing is understanding the system, understanding the touch points, establishing how that would look like in an ideal target state world, and then starting to measure the effects of the communication between the teams responsible for those components. And then, based on, let's say, the negative measurements, starting to make fine-grained, iterative, small-scale changes over time, and sometimes maybe those changes are quite macro as well. Does that answer your question?
Why would you have a hierarchical organization structure if everything works without?
Yeah, okay. No one pattern will work, right? It works alone and nothing else. So you're absolutely right. That might be a very optimal approach, given the culture of your organization, to flatten everything. But of course, other organizations aren't as let's say, I don't know the right word here, I want to use the word liberal. I know that's not right. But maybe don't have that progressive thought process. But they can solve the problem as well through different mechanisms. They can still have their hierarchies and establish the resolution through process and governance and different ways of working as well. It may not be as efficient, but it may be the best approach for them. And sometimes there's reason for these organization structures, right? Compliance, it depends what industry you're in. There might be a necessity for those things, which limits what you can do on an organizational level.
Thank you for the good presentation. My question is related to the service and product relationship in this model. How do you see it in this law?
Could you expand a little bit?
Yes. For example, you mentioned that we look about the services from the code that we develop. That is one part. But then from the customer point of view, they are not only using the product, they are using services. And what is the relationship between product, services, product, how it is looking from the customer point of view and the experience that they will use through different products?
Okay. I think I understand. So let me formulate my response first. So the service is, as I said, a collection of touch points. And some of those touch points, and probably a large volume of those touch points, are inside the product. And it's about the product functionality, the product capability. And yes, that is part of the service. But there are other aspects to the service as well, other expectations that the customers have that go beyond, what would be considered functionality of the product. So onboarding, that we mentioned that about the ability to, from the moment you sign a contract, have access to the system. Well, what's required for something like that? Actually, a whole host of things need to happen. You need to take the concept of that customer. You need to build it into your customer master data system. You need to have it built into your ERP and your billing systems. There's various different components. Maybe it needs to be built into your access management solution as well. Maybe it's been delivered through a partner and we need to start talking about identity and access management for the configuration portals to the partner consultants as well. Huge amounts of potential complexity involved in that. The majority of the complexity involved in that actually has nothing to do with the product. It's all to do with these outer rim components. But it still needs to be systematic. It still needs to be automated. And as a result of that, you have to build the connection points between these components. And what I'm saying is you need to do that as if these components were a product. And it's really what you're developing there isn't so much the core product necessarily. A lot of the times they're off-the-shelf technologies and solutions. But you're wrapping a layer around these components, which facilitate integration to the other components. I hope that answered your question. I've been staring at the clock. Yep.
All right. Hey, let's give a big hand for Alistair.
Thank you.